The early morning sky was painted in shades of pink and orange as the sun rose high, awakening the magnificent beauty of the Windsor Castle grounds. A gentle breeze swept through the ancient trees, gliding past the wrought iron fences, as if recounting a tale of centuries, witnessing countless rises and falls. Visitors from all around the world gathered around the viewing area, eagerly wanting to witness the grandeur of the place's historical legacy. In the midst of this quiet atmosphere, a familiar figure appeared, though not something new. It was Guard William Roberts, a royal guard with over 14 years of experience in the military. William's image was one of resilience. Beneath his fur-trimmed hat, his gaze never strayed from the front, like a soldier holding the line in the heart of a battlefield. Thousands of hours of training and long deployments in Iraq and Syria had shaped him into a man of steel, a warrior who never showed signs of fatigue, no matter how chaotic the world around him. In stark contrast to his steadiness was the noisy atmosphere of the crowd surrounding him. Tourists from different countries laughed, chatted, and took photos, unaware that beneath his red uniform was a soldier who had faced the storms of war and stood firm through countless hardships. William was not the type to be easily moved. He had learned to control all his emotions, keeping his mind steady no matter the circumstance. Every movement, every step, was perfected through rigorous training, with no detail left out. Everything had become automatic, like a reflex of instinct. Yet, despite this, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different in the air this morning. It wasn't the admiring glances from the tourists, but something more vague, as if an unclear threat was slowly creeping into the space around him. Suddenly, his gaze stopped, and his feet shifted slightly. A figure stood out in the crowd, a woman not far from him, and something about her made him feel alert. It was Olivia Morgan. The way she moved, the way she commanded the space around her, made William feel as though a disruption was about to unfold. She wasn't just an ordinary tourist. She was a challenge. The morning light still shone on the red roofs of Windsor Palace, but it could not ease the stifling heat in the air or the tension that was steadily rising in William's chest. The crowd grew larger, with the sounds of laughter, conversations, and camera shutters filling the air, making the space around him even more chaotic. Yet all of those noises seemed to filter through a layer of glass, becoming distant and blurry. Only the stillness remained in the heart of the guard, like a shield against everything around him. This was how William had learned to survive in the world of battles. He always maintained his cold composure, focusing solely on his duty and the safety of himself and those around him. Then a voice called out, soft but strong enough to break the silence, shattering it like a crack in glass. "Hello! Don't you understand English?" The sharp tone of the voice sliced through the air like a knife, causing everything in that space to come to a sudden halt, no one daring to speak. Olivia Morgan stood there, amidst the crowd, as if she were the center of all attention. Her steps were purposeful, not those of an ordinary tourist, but of someone who believed everything should revolve around her. Her luxurious silk coat fluttered in the wind, and her high heels clicked sharply on the cold stone pavement. Every movement of hers seemed calculated, leaving no room for spontaneity. She adjusted her sunglasses and approached a palace staff member standing nearby. "Can you show me the best photo spots here? I don't have all day to wander around like the others." Olivia spoke in a dismissive tone, full of contempt. Her cold, sharp eyes showed no interest in the staff member's explanation. She was only focused on one thing: getting her request fulfilled without delay. The palace staff member maintained his professionalism, smiling but sensing the tension beginning to rise. "Ma'am, there are designated areas for sightseeing. This is a rule of the palace to maintain order." But Olivia wasn't listening. She interrupted, her voice cutting through like a bullet. "Rules? What rules?" Olivia laughed. "Rules for people like me or for people like you? Let me see if anyone dares not to follow my request." The palace staff member stood silently, but a weary look flashed in his eyes. He couldn't argue, couldn't do anything other than maintain his composure while facing this woman, whose confidence was not based on ability, but on wealth and status. William had encountered this feeling before, but not from ordinary tourists. People like Olivia couldn't be shaken because their arrogance had built a strong armor that no one could penetrate. William began to observe more closely. He realized that, despite standing firm in his uniform, he felt an odd sense of unease when looking at this woman. It wasn't because of the anger in her voice, but because of the clear challenge in her every action. Olivia, like a rising wave, was ready to sweep away anyone who dared to stand in her way. And she had found her first target, the palace staff member. But then, William's attention couldn't leave her. As Olivia started to bother another staff member, a strange wave rose within him. It wasn't frustration, but the feeling that a battle was quietly beginning, as if everything were fated. He had fought thousands of battles, faced death itself, but this time was different. She had no gun, no bullets, but the way she challenged the rules, the way she broke every boundary, made him feel an unsettling anxiety. Olivia continued to move, confidently taking steps closer to where William stood. She looked at him, her gaze as sharp as a knife, then asked a question as if requesting an item from a luxury store. "Can you take a photo with me? A beautiful picture with a royal guard would surely be impressive. You wouldn't want to keep a VIP like me waiting, would you?" Her words were a heavy challenge, making the atmosphere around them feel frozen and suffocating. William didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, looking at her, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword, not to cause violence, but to steady himself in a situation he knew something would happen. The atmosphere around the palace area suddenly grew heavy, even though just moments before, everything had been vibrant, filled with the laughter of tourists. But as Olivia drew nearer, each of her steps seemed like a soft knock on William's heart, drawing his attention without fail. She was no longer an ordinary tourist. She was a challenge that William knew, despite his reluctance to face it, he could not ignore. "Can you hear me? I need a place to take a picture. Why should I wait while you all just stand still like statues?" Olivia continued to provoke him, constantly showing disdain for the formal rituals that William represented. Her words were like bullets aimed straight at the heart of the guard, yet William stood firm, not responding. He did not react. He had learned this long ago. Silence is the strength of soldiers. Every movement he made was a careful calculation. Olivia's words were not enough to shake him, but there was still an unease growing within him. Something in Olivia's attitude made him feel this was not just a simple annoyance. She had a unique way of making everything feel like it was her game. And in this game, William clearly sensed there would be only one winner, and that winner was not him. Olivia stared at William, her face showing no hint of hesitation, as if she were confronting someone who had no authority. She didn't seem to notice the tension rising in the air. "Don't you know who I am?" She raised her voice, her arrogance clearly evident in every word. "I flew over 6,000 miles just to see this place. Do you have any idea how many people would kill for this opportunity?" She paused, looking around with a scornful, challenging expression. "But I guess to you, VIPs like me are nothing important." Each word she said was like a knife wound to the solid wall that William had built throughout his years in the military. But he stood motionless, unyielding, not changing his demeanor. William had learned to remain resolute in the most tense situations, but at this moment, standing before this arrogant and challenging woman, he could feel an unspoken tension. It wasn't anger. It was the silence of important decisions being made within him. Olivia realized that despite her attempts to draw attention, William remained unchanged. He still stood there cold, as if he hadn't heard a word she said. But this only made Olivia feel more disregarded. She was not someone who took defeat easily. She stepped closer, determined to prove that she had the power to control everything. "Don't you see? You're just a useless guard, standing here doing nothing but keeping your posture," Olivia continued, stretching out each word to make her statement feel like a slap in William's face. She didn't realize that the more she tried to embarrass him, the more she revealed her own helplessness. Olivia didn't understand that William's silence wasn't weakness. It was a symbol of inner strength that she couldn't touch. However, what made everything worse was Olivia's gaze. Her challenging stare made William feel like he was facing something completely different. A strange, powerful wave of uncontrollable emotion was rising within him. He couldn't deny that a part of him felt the chill of contempt. Another part felt the fear that this situation could escalate too far. Olivia stopped, standing directly in front of William, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't stop trying to provoke him, pushing him to react, to show his anger. She believed that a guard, no matter how professionally trained, could not stand still and endure such insults forever. William remained unmoved. He sensed the threat, but it wasn't coming from Olivia. It was coming from within himself. He knew that if he allowed her to continue provoking him, he would make a serious mistake, one that would not only affect him, but everything he had sworn to protect. But deep down, he understood that everyone has their limit. And Olivia, unknowingly, had just crossed that line. The tension had reached its peak. Everything was now waiting for the spark that would set it all off. Olivia finally decided to take what she thought was her victory step. She moved closer to William, extended her hand, and delivered her challenge. "Take the picture, or I will report you to your superiors." Her words were a decisive blow, and no one could predict what would happen next. The tension, like a rope tightening around William's heart, had reached its breaking point. Olivia stood facing William, her gaze fixed on him, her expression showing no attempt to hide her disdain. She had thought that she could do something to make the guard bow his head, to prove that her authority was stronger than any rules or respect. But William remained unmoved. He didn't even glance at her, his eyes cold and emotionless, as though she were just a faint shadow in the crowd around him. Olivia felt William's determination grow increasingly like a challenge to her. She could not accept that someone dared to disregard her, to ignore her while she was at the height of her self-satisfaction. With every passing second, her anger flared up stronger, like a fire beyond control. Facing William's silence, she felt herself forced into a battle she had not prepared for. His stillness, the way he stood firm in front of her, made her feel powerless. "Don't you know who I am?" Olivia snarled, trying to break the silence with her voice. "Do you realize I'm a VIP? People like me have the right to demand everything. I paid. I deserve to be treated this way." These words came from Olivia's mouth, but inside, she felt no sense of satisfaction. On the contrary, she felt as if she were sinking deeper into the pit she had dug herself. She had thought money and fame could buy respect, that she had the right to control everything. But facing William, all those things seemed meaningless. The coldness in his gaze wasn't affected by her triumph, and that made Olivia feel not only angry but also defeated. William, meanwhile, felt an inexplicable fatigue spreading through his body. He had faced armed enemies, been in situations where his life hung in the balance. But now, standing before a woman like Olivia, he felt a helplessness he had never experienced before. She had no weapons, nothing but her arrogance and self-importance. But it made him feel like he was facing an enemy harder to defeat than anyone he had fought before. They stood there, one unyielding like a wall, unchanging, while the other tried to turn the situation to her advantage, only making the tension grow. Then, as if Olivia could no longer stand it, she took a step forward, closing the gap between them, her face now just a hand's breadth from his. "Who do you think you are? Standing there like a useless statue?" Olivia sneered, her arms crossed in front of her chest, her anger clearly evident in her voice. "I've spent so much money, effort, and time just to get here. You could do nothing but stand there like a fool? Give me a photo, or I won't let this go." Each of Olivia's words struck at William's patience. But he didn't react. Not because he didn't want to, but because he had learned to face provocation without letting emotions take over. He couldn't allow himself to fall into this battle, couldn't let it overshadow everything he had sacrificed over the years. But his silence was itself a challenge to Olivia, and she couldn't stand it. In Olivia's eyes, William was no longer a royal guard. He was an enemy, an unshakable shadow, making her feel like she was being pushed out of the game she had thought she would win. She couldn't stand his indifference, his disregard for her power. She took another step closer, not just physically, but in pushing her provocation to the limit. "This is unbelievable," Olivia said, her voice now not just tense, but filled with mockery. "You really think you have the right to just stand there like that? Don't you see how everyone else here is looking at me? They all see me. They all understand I'm important." These words finally made the tension so thick it felt suffocating. The surrounding tourists began to look at the situation with unease. Some secretly filmed, while others started pointing and whispering. But William remained standing, his gaze unchanged, with no sign that he would give in. With a decisive movement, Olivia raised her hand and grabbed the collar of William's uniform, pulling him closer. "Take the photo. I don't have all day to wait," she screamed, as if all her power had been poured into that action. Everything suddenly became eerily silent, as if the air in the palace courtyard had abruptly stopped circulating. William stood motionless, his eyes unwavering. But inside, his entire body was tense, like a taut string ready to snap in the next moment. The coldness in his gaze was not only the discipline of the military, but also the chill of a man who had grown accustomed to tension, who had long been familiar with the feeling of being pushed to the edge. But now, it was not the enemy on the battlefield standing before him. It was a woman, Olivia. Olivia, meanwhile, felt an uncontrollable fury building up within her. With each passing second, her pride was challenged by William's indifference. She had never encountered anyone like him, someone who would not bow before wealth, fame, or power. She was used to everything revolving around her, used to no one daring to defy her commands. But now, William stood there, firm as a rock, not the slightest bit shaken. That feeling of being disregarded and powerless made Olivia unable to bear it any longer. "Who do you think you are?" Olivia shouted, her voice suddenly breaking, her anger bursting out like a wave. "Don't you see who I am? Do you know how much money I've spent on this trip, what I've done to get to this position? And you, what are you? Just some lowly guard standing watch at a tourist site." Olivia tried to drag out each word, as if she were trying to push William to his breaking point. But William did not respond, his silence making her feel even more suffocated. Olivia clenched her hands, a feeling of losing control rising within her. She thought she could use her fury to force him to yield, but now she realized that all her efforts seemed to have no effect. The sense of helplessness and hurt made her lose the last bit of restraint. Without waiting any longer, Olivia took another step forward, into the very space that William had been trying to protect for years. Her hand reached out, no longer with the caution of a tourist, but with the intent of someone trying to take control of everything. She grabbed the collar of William's uniform, pulling hard, forcing him to lower his head and face her. William felt the strong tug, Olivia's pull like a blow to his sense of self-respect. Not because of the insult, but because of the unacceptable invasion. He could not allow her, or anyone, to disrespect and violate the values he had protected his entire life. The coldness in his eyes had now shifted to an uncontrollable tension. He had to act. That moment, when Olivia's hand gripped him, felt like a flash of lightning tearing through the space. Suddenly, William moved, not in an act of brute force, but with a decisive motion. His right hand reached out, not aiming at Olivia's body, but at the phone she was holding, an object that symbolized the disrespect she showed him and everything he stood for. The sound of the phone shattering echoed like a gunshot in the stillness of the space. The broken screen reflected the shards of light from the early morning sun. The crowd suddenly fell silent, no one daring to speak, but all eyes were on Olivia, the woman who had once been the center of attention, now standing still, her face a mix of astonishment and anger. Olivia bent down to look at her phone, a feeling of helplessness and horror rising within her. She could not comprehend what had just happened. Each shard felt like a knife cutting into her self-esteem, the very thing she had once prided herself on: power, wealth, the respect of those around her. Now all seemed meaningless. She couldn't tell if this was a personal failure or a thunderous slap in the face to the world she had built for herself. Her eyes flashed with rage, but there was also something resembling fear, a feeling Olivia never thought she would have to face. "Don't you know who I am?" Olivia screamed, but this time, Her voice was no longer as certain as before. Her words sounded like fragments, lost and powerless. "You will pay for this. You cannot destroy my property without facing consequences." William did not reply. He stood there, like a living statue, silent and steady. His feelings at this moment were not excitement or pride, but a calmness filled with pain. He knew that what had happened could not be undone, and no matter how angry Olivia was, everything had been sealed the moment he pushed the phone from her hands. But within him, another feeling was rising, worry about the consequences of his actions. The tension in the air continued to build, and William felt keenly that he was standing at the brink of something larger. Everything around him seemed to be falling into chaos, but in that moment, he felt that he was walking down a path long laid out before him. The road was not an easy one, but he knew he could not turn back. What he had done was not just for himself, but for everything he had sworn to protect: respect, rules, and the very essence of what he represented. Olivia did not know what to do. She stood there, fists clenched, her eyes filled with fury. Inside, an unfamiliar feeling was rising, a sense of helplessness she had never experienced. The people around her, those who had once idolized her, now stood by watching, no one coming to help. They looked at her as though she were a loser, someone who no longer had power, no longer held the same position as before. Olivia turned, took a few steps, then stopped, trying to force a smile, but her grin only made everyone feel more tense. "Do you think I will give up?" she yelled, her voice echoing across the courtyard. But even as her words rang out, Olivia knew she no longer had the strength to pull anyone to her side. Her threats were now nothing more than hollow sounds, devoid of weight. In that moment, a security officer stepped forward from a distance, his face silent, but his eyes filled with resolve. "You need to calm down," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "Your actions have crossed the line. This is a criminal offense." Olivia turned to face the officer, her expression no longer one of arrogance, but of confusion and exhaustion. She no longer knew where she stood or if she still had any power to deal with the situation. "Who do you think I am?" she muttered, her voice now much weaker. William did not speak. He remained still, but his silence was a powerful response. He looked at Olivia, then slowly turned away, his gaze fixed ahead, no longer swayed by any words. He knew he had done the right thing, and despite whatever consequences he might face, he would not regret it. In that moment, Olivia realized it was too late. The sense of losing control made her feel as though she were being swept away in an unstoppable whirlwind. In that painful moment, she was no longer the powerful woman she had once prided herself on being, but a defeated soul, standing before a man who remained unmoved. The police officer moved closer, and the guards began to form a barrier around Olivia. She could feel the gazes of those around her, the eyes that no longer held respect, no longer admiration. All that she had once had, all that she had believed in, was now shattered. She could not have imagined that she would find herself in this situation. Olivia did not say another word as the police escorted her away. Her eyes, which had always been bright with confidence and arrogance, now dulled with disappointment and helplessness. Her steps were no longer quick and nimble, but rather stumbling, each one a reminder of the collapse she had never imagined. It was not the worry of an investigation or a lawsuit that caused this, but the bitter reality she could not deny. The power she once held was now gone. The crowd around her began to disperse, but their gazes still followed Olivia's every move. Whispers spread like a dark cloud in the air. Some people recorded the scene on their phones, but none of them made any attempt to intervene. They simply stood there, looking at her with a mix of pity and disdain. The indirect criticisms were enough to make Olivia feel humiliated before the crowd. She, who once thought she could walk into this place and change everything to her will, was now being pushed out with no regard. The police remained steadfast, guiding her out, but within the silence, there was a sense of weariness that permeated the air. Olivia was not a criminal, nor was she someone with harmful intent, but her defiance against the rules, against everything that William represented, was something unforgivable. A small act, like a broken phone, had caused a storm she could never have anticipated. The feeling of being dethroned was uncomfortable and bitter. Olivia had once lived in a world where everything could be bought, where her demands were always met immediately. But today, facing William, she realized that there were things money and power could not purchase. It was not because he was stronger than her, but because he possessed something she could never have: determination and respect for himself and the work he did. William stood there, his eyes still fixed ahead, silent as an unbreachable wall. He did not look back, nor did he offer any apology or remorse. He did not need to explain. Everything had been made clear the moment Olivia's phone flew from her hand. Yet that did not mean he felt completely unaffected. He had fought in fierce battles, faced death in situations where one small mistake could cost him his life. But today, standing before a proud woman like Olivia, he felt a strange tension, not out of fear, but because he knew that, even though his actions were right, they would lead to consequences he could not predict. While the crowd began to return to their activities, as if nothing had happened, William remained standing, his posture unchanged. But his heart, though outwardly calm, was in turmoil. He knew this incident would not pass easily. Olivia might return, perhaps making things more complicated. But he also understood one thing: respect for oneself and one's work could not be compromised, no matter what difficulties might arise. As the police led Olivia out of the palace grounds, everything began to return to normal. The scene she had caused came to a close, but the consequences would remain. The tourists around continued their visit, but in their hearts, a lesson had been learned. A lesson about respect, about understanding that not everything in life could be bought with money or power. A few minutes later, another group of security staff approached William, but not to criticize or reprimand him. They looked at him in silence, but their eyes conveyed understanding, an empathy that words could not express. They knew that people like William, the royal guards, always had to face challenges that could not be seen. They had to be patient, maintaining respect not only for those around them, but also for themselves. William took a deep breath and exhaled softly. Throughout his life as a soldier, he had learned to accept difficult decisions. And today, once again, he knew he had done the right thing. Meanwhile, the tourists had gradually left, and the atmosphere around the palace became quiet again. A new day had begun, and William resumed his work, without fanfare, without applause or praise. But in his heart, he knew that the values he upheld, respect, discipline, and self-respect, remained steadfast, like a stone wall that could never be broken. The scene before him gradually faded as the police car disappeared behind the dense trees. The crowd of tourists had dispersed, but the air around them still felt thick with awkwardness and anxiety. Too much had happened, and it seemed that every step Olivia took as she was led away by the police left an indelible mark in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Curious gazes, whispers full of intrigue, all focused on her. The woman who was no longer a symbol of power and arrogance, but a failure, unbalanced and broken. William stood there silently, with only the sound of his light, but steady footsteps as he continued his duties. However, inside, an empty feeling suddenly surged within him. His outward calm could not hide the tension gnawing at his mind. He had done the right thing. He knew that, but why did his heart still not feel entirely at peace? It felt as though he had completed an important mission, but without the sense of victory, just a lingering feeling of something unresolved deep inside. His years in the military, facing danger and war, had never confronted him with a situation as tense as this, one where there was no clear enemy, yet it was full of silent challenges. Olivia, with her arrogance and pride, had put him in a position where everything seemed blurred. His actions had not only been to defend tradition and respect for his role, but also to preserve a part of himself, something no one had the right to violate. But in that moment, he realized that everything was not just about rules and orders. Everything, even in the military, sometimes came at a cost, a price that, whether he wanted to or not, he had to face. And no matter the reason, Olivia had become part of that price. There was nothing more he could do but continue his watch, endure the gazes of those around him, and live with the loneliness that felt almost desperate. It was in that moment, as the storm of tension began to subside, that William's thoughts were drawn into a dark space he rarely visited: uncertainty. Had he done the right thing? Was the cost of his actions really what he wanted? The question cut into his mind like a sharp knife, impossible to shake off. Did Olivia deserve to be treated this way? She was not an evil person or an enemy in a war, just a woman with too much pride who did not respect basic values. But was that enough to make her his target, to force him to confront her and break the respect others had for her? Unconsciously, William looked around, his gaze meeting an experienced pair of eyes, a man standing nearby who had watched everything unfold from start to finish. The elderly man smiled gently, a kind smile full of understanding. He walked over, placing his hand lightly on William's shoulder. Everyone has moments when they must make a decision, son. But what matters is that you have been true to yourself. That is something no one can take away. The old man's words calmed a part of William's heart. The questions in his mind seemed to lose their weight. The man, without saying anything complicated or difficult, had clarified something William had forgotten amidst his thoughts. He had acted out of respect, not just for his job, but for the values he had spent years building. When the old man's gaze lingered on William's face for a long moment, he softly said, "You will understand as time passes. A battle may not always end with a resounding victory, but inner peace is the true victory." The old man's words cut through William's thoughts like a sharp blade. He knew that the man was not just talking about today's battle, but about all the battles he had faced throughout his life. He understood that sometimes a victory did not have to be easy or clear. Sometimes, the true victory was the peace in one's heart, not allowing external provocations or challenges to shake one's core. William smiled, thanking the old man, then returned to his post. His thoughts began to quiet, and his worries seemed to fade. He no longer felt the need to prove anything. It was true that his actions today might have caused a stir, but he knew he had protected something priceless: his self-respect and the respect for the values he represented. The evening sunlight began to glow faintly on the horizon, casting soft rays through the trees, creating an unusually peaceful scene amidst the hustle and bustle of the palace grounds. Beneath William's feet, the cobblestones lay still, with no trace of the events that had transpired. The crowd had slowly dispersed, leaving only the steady footsteps of the guards and palace staff continuing their work, as if everything had returned to normal. William had not changed his position. He stood there, as solid as a stone wall, his eyes still fixed ahead. Though the evening light had eased the heat of the morning, the tension in his heart remained unrelieved. Every passing minute, the question, "Did I do the right thing?" resurfaced in his mind, gnawing at him like an unhealed wound. He wondered, could it be that sometimes discipline and respect are merely shields hiding the weakness and fear within? The scene with Olivia was still vivid in his mind. The insults, the provocative actions, and finally, the shattering of the phone, a symbol of power and arrogance. But as everything passed and Olivia was led away by the police, he realized something important. Every action, whether large or small, right or wrong, has its price. Not everyone can understand immediately, and respect is not always reciprocated right away. But what mattered was that he had stood firm in the values he believed in, despite all challenges. Only in hindsight did he understand that today's events were not simply a confrontation between a guard and a disrespectful tourist. It was a profound lesson in patience, respect for tradition, and above all, self-respect. Olivia may have failed to force William to change, but in her own way, she had taught him a valuable lesson. Sometimes, victory is not about winning everyone's approval, but about staying true to oneself in the face of challenges. William could not forget Olivia's gaze when her phone shattered on the ground. It was not a look of anger, but of disappointment. Disappointment not because of the phone, but because she realized that everything she had believed in, power, money, and arrogance, could no longer change the fact that a guard could still stand firm, maintaining his dignity, unshaken by anyone. Looking back, William realized that moments like this were not to be feared, but rather moments in which we learn about ourselves. Life's challenges, whether big or small, do not always bring obvious victories. But in those times when we face difficulties and still manage to hold our ground, that is the true victory. William's actions were not just a response to Olivia, but also a rebellion against hypocrisy, against violated values. He did not let her arrogance cloud the ideals he had chosen for his life. It was a lesson in standing up for what is right, even when faced with discomfort and relentless challenges. At that moment, standing in the middle of the palace grounds, one thing was clear to William. Victory is not always brilliant and clear-cut. It may be the silence of a guard, standing firm through the years, protecting the values he believes in. And sometimes, the lesson does not come from others, but from the quiet moments when we must face the insecurity within our own souls. Life may be full of challenges, but it is up to us to decide whether we can maintain the values we believe in. And in the end, silence and resilience, though not always acknowledged, are the true victories that each of us can achieve.